Hello. Thank you for watching Taxpayer Alert. I'm Al Segalla. I'll be your host for this program, and this is one in over 120, well, about 120 episodes. We've covered a lot of ground, and we had the most amazing people as guests, and this is no exception. Our guest this time is James Burling, who's Vice President of Legal Affairs for the Pacific Legal Foundation. The Pacific Legal Foundation is a foremost defender of property rights, and they've done a wonderful work. Jim, welcome.
Hey, glad to be here.
All right. Now, how long have you been involved in this enterprise that you've been doing?
Only for 36 years.
Oh, you started out.
Yeah, I think I'm going to make it my career.
Okay, that's cool. There was a recent case that had a profound effect in allowing cases of violation of property rights or takings to go directly to federal courts rather than local courts. Is that correct?
That's correct. So this is a case called Nick versus Scott Township. And let me take you back a little bit, just maybe a little bit before your time, before mine, to the Civil War. Okay. After the Civil War, Congress passed the Civil War amendments, which basically said a lot of the rights that are in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights also apply against the states. And a few years after that, they passed a statute saying that anybody could go directly into federal court to vindicate their constitutional rights. And that's the way it was for many years. If the local government violated your free speech rights, you could go to federal court. If the local government was doing something to your property, you could go to federal court. But in 1984, in a case called Williamson County, the Supreme Court did this kind of U-turn. And they said, well, no, if you're trying to vindicate your property rights, you first have to go to state court. And you have to go through the entire state court system. And that created some problems. Because, first of all, state courts are often the same people, the judges are part of the same group of people that pass the statute in the first place that you're trying to argue against. You get hometowned. Second, sometimes you want to have a different set of court as judges, and so you want to go into federal court, just like for every other constitutional right. But in this case called Williamson County, the court said you have to go first to state court. Then a few years later, in another case out of San Francisco, they said, and if you do go to state court, you can't ever go to federal court, because the state court could have decided the federal issue as well. So for a number of years, property rights was the only right that you could not go into federal court to protect. And so here we move fast forward to, and the court and members of the court began to say, this is a problem. We see a problem here. We represented some people that would file a case arguing that the local government took their property from excessive zoning or regulation or protection of some critter or something like that. And we would argue that the property had been taken in state court, at which point the local government would say, oh, this should go into federal court. They would get it into federal court, and they say, but it doesn't belong in federal court, and the case should be thrown out, and it would be thrown out. It doesn't make any sense what you just heard, but that was the way it was. You'd start in state court, then get it tossed out, and you'd never get your claim heard. So let's talk about Ms. Nick. Ms. Nick is an elderly woman. She owns about 90 acres of property in rural Pennsylvania, a number of miles north of Scranton. She's in the middle of nowhere. And on her property, there are some old stones. Now, back during the colonial era, when the Bill of Rights was first passed, people often would bury their relatives in family plots on their property. If you had a big farm, there was no central place to do it. You'd have your own grave site. So on Ms. Nick's property, there are some old stones. What are they? We're not sure. But some locals thought that, maybe they are graves of ancestors there. And so we want the right to visit these stones and pay respects. Ms. Nick said, I don't think they're graves. Besides, it's my property, and I don't want anybody traipsing across my property. And she said, no, you can't go on my property. It's my property. Look, I'm an elderly woman. I'm not very comfortable with members of the public going on my property. And she said no to them. At which point, the local grave activists, if you will, they went to the local town council and said, pass a law saying that any member of the public can visit any alleged grave site at any time of the day. And the local town passed a law. And then they brought an enforcement action against Ms. Nick saying, you're not letting people onto your property. You're in violation of our law. And therefore, you should be subject to penalties, a fine and a misdemeanor. So she argued that this is wrong. She went to state court. When she went to state court, the town dropped the enforcement penalty, and it dropped the enforcement action. And then the town said, there's no case because we're not enforcing the law against her today. And the state court dismissed the case. And so she still had this public easement on her property now. The public still had a right to go into her property, and they wouldn't help her keeping the trespassers off. So she went to federal court. She went to federal court saying, look, the town is taking an easement on my property. They're allowing any member of the public to go onto my property to look at these old stones any time of the day. So she went to federal court saying they're taking my property, I want that to stop, and I want to be paid if they're going to take an easement. If they're going to take a valuable easement, this is really costing me a lot of heartburn, and it's devaluing my property because anybody can go across it any time of the day. And so she went to federal court, and the federal court said, no. Remember Williamson County? Williamson County said you can't bring a taking claim in federal court. We're applying it. And she got kicked out of federal court. So she got kicked out of state court. She got kicked out of federal court. We took over the case at that point, and we represented her and asked the U.S. Supreme Court to take the case. Now, the Supreme Court only takes about 2 or 3 cases out of every 100 that are presented to it for review.
Right.
And we had asked the court at least 10 times before to take other cases to deal this Williamson County issue, saying it should be reversed. People should be allowed to go into federal court. So she got into federal court, got into the U.S. Supreme Court. They agreed to take the case, and we argued it first Wednesday in October when we had 8 justices. That was before Justice Kavanaugh was on the court.
Right. And
they had oral argument, asked a lot of questions, were obviously confused about some aspects of the case, and they did nothing for about a month. And then they said, we want to hear argument all over again, this time with Justice Kavanaugh. So it's kind of clear that they were pretty split down the middle in the case.
Right.
We had oral argument again. Better questions this time. I think the justices were better prepared. They asked lots and lots of questions of our attorneys, lots of questions of the city's attorneys, and lots of questions of the federal government because the federal government joined on our side.
Well, that helps.
That does help. They were making an argument that was a little off-center from what we were asking for, but it was still helpful to have the federal government on our side. I don't think that would have happened, say, 3 or 4 years ago, but it happened with the current Justice Department. So we went to court, and toward the very end of June, very end of the term, on June 24th, we had a 5-4 decision saying that the Williamson County decision is wrong. They tossed it out, and now anybody who complains that the state or the local government is depriving them of their property rights can now go into federal court. So landowners have a choice, state court or federal court.
Right.
In some areas, that may be fine because state courts are fine. In California, as interesting as the Ninth Circuit may be, it is less interesting than the California state courts are. So many property owners in California are certainly going to want to go into federal court, and they now have that right thanks to our Nick versus Scott Township case.
Wow, what a story. Now, this can affect our Calaveras County issues as well, because one of the problems we have is increasing government control of private property through a land use planning. And we're trying to keep that reasonable and rational. And it seems now this could be another tool if in fact, a property owner was deprived of the use of their property because of this.
Absolutely. I mean, nobody wants to sue their government, right? Because it's expensive, it's time-consuming, and no local government wants to get sued.
Right.
Now, before we had our decision in Nick, local governments could look at it and say, well, if we get sued, we're only going to be sued in state court, and governments usually win on these land use issues in state courts.
Right.
So they look at the calculus and say, we don't necessarily have a lot to lose. Let's just have a draconian regulation that has adverse impacts on property owners and let them sue because they're likely to win. But now they have to think a little more carefully because they can not only be sued in state court, but they can be sued in federal court. And federal courts oftentimes, as I said earlier, are less beholden to the local interests. They see the bigger picture. And when we're talking about constitutional rights, and that's why you'd go into federal court, the right to use your property, the right to be paid if the government takes your property, that's in the Constitution. And federal courts take those rights much more seriously sometimes than some state courts. Now, look, a lot of state courts and state court judges are very good. They take this stuff very seriously.
Right.
But your odds, I think, are better in a number of federal courts.
Well, the effect may not be a lawsuit. The effect that there could be a lawsuit could make our Board of Supervisors, Planning Commission members more sensitive to the prospect of having a problem down the road because of the wording that they're putting into the general plan.
They have to be really careful. When you're drawing up a general plan that's going to affect people in the community, you do not want to do it in a way that's going to make people so unhappy and hurt them in such a way that they're going to feel compelled to file a lawsuit. I think that a good general planner, and there are many good planners out there, realize that, look, what we want to do is have a solution that's going to have everybody in the community well served, not to have something that's going to be shoved down people's throats that's going to result in a lawsuit. And now the likelihood of a lawsuit in federal court is substantially higher than it was before if the planner doesn't do the right thing. So I think it is going to give incentive to planners to do the right thing.
Oh, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Now, there's another a case regarding rent control that is interesting. Would you like to talk about that?
Oh, I'd love to talk about rent control. There's a book that was published about 20 years ago called Rent Control, Myths and Realities. And it's one of my favorite books, and I like it for the pictures, not for the words. And they have some famous economists, Milton Friedman and others that are have words in it. But there are pictures in this book. And the pictures are of inner cities that have been just devastated. And the caption under each one of these dozen or so pictures is, such and such city, damage from rent control or bombing in a war, ? And you can't tell by looking at the picture. You have to go to the back and look it up and say, oh, this city was bombed during World War II. That's why it looks awful. But this city had rent control. And the rent control was so bad and so draconian that people began to abandon buildings. They would get taken over by squatters. They would burn. And you have these wiped out urban devastation areas.
Like San Francisco.
Like San Francisco. San Francisco is getting bad. It's probably going to get worse. I mean, look, there are a whole lot of different factors that are contributing to the mess that San Francisco is in right now.
Right.
But rent control is certainly one of them. And every economist of any note that's looked at rent control from the left or the right will say, look, the long-term consequences of rent control are not good. It discourages new home construction, which makes no sense when you have a housing shortage. It discourages landlords from investing in their property. Yeah, landlords are supposed to be guaranteed a reasonable return on their investment, but when push comes to shove, Rent boards will say, well, your investment, your mortgages don't count for that. Or if you put in one type of countertop, maybe you should have done a cheaper kind. And they nickel and dime the increases that landlords need to do the improvements that property has.
Who would want to build rentals in such conditions?
Who would want to build rentals? So we've had, and people realize that in the state, so we had a statute passed called Costa-Hawkins that said new rental properties would not be subject to rent control. But the last election, you remember there was an attempt to have that overturned. And now our legislature and the same people want to go at it again and have rent control applied to all properties, even down to, back to the prior one was even down to single-family homes. They're kind of cut back a little bit for now, but I'm concerned. Oregon just passed statewide rent control. New York just expanded their rent control. It seems to be the progressive thing to want to do, to pass new rent control, but it doesn't help in the end. Al, we did a study once, about 15 years ago, comparing rent-controlled jurisdictions in California to neighboring jurisdictions without rent control. Because whenever a rent control ordinance is passed, the reasons given are rent control is going to help the poor, it's going to help the people with less education, it's going to help minorities, it's going to help the elderly, it's going to help all those people who are socially and economically dispossessed, right? So we compare the people living in rent-controlled apartments in one community with people living in non-rent controlled apartments in the next community without rent control. And in each and every case, we found without exception that the people living in the rent-controlled communities were richer, better educated, whiter, more of the center of the age demographic, not too young, not too old. Basically, the people that are better off are the ones that are able to take advantage of rent control because they have the stability in their lives. They can live in an area for a longer period of time. They're not required to move looking for new jobs and that kind of thing. So rent control doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It fails to advance the goals and purposes set out for rent control. And yet we have it, we're stuck with it because it's an immediate knee-jerk thing that the left wants to do. We challenged rent control in a lawsuit a number of years ago, saying it fails to substantially advance a legitimate governmental interest, which was a test for looking at regulations to whether they should be thrown out or not. And we actually won at the Court of Appeal here in California. Rent control is thrown out in Santa Monica. And then the California Supreme Court said, well, rent control serves another purpose other than all those that are set out in the laws. It keeps the price of rentals lower. Like, duh, but that's not, is that legitimate? Well, the Supreme Court of California thought it was, and the U.S. Supreme Court didn't take the case. But we're hoping with our Supreme Court and the way that the court is changing, that we would like to get a rent control case up to the Supreme Court to have the court look very hard at the impact on property rights, the property rights of the owners of the property and how that affects them, and indirectly how that adversely affects people in the city who want affordable housing. If you win the lottery and you get into a rent-controlled unit, fine, but everybody else suffers disproportionately more. So we'd love to see that case up sometime.
It's like taking money from some to give to others. It seems to be the basic of Marxism, and in my opinion, I think that the only justification for government involvement with property would be for public safety, not to take control of the property away from the property owner.
When rent control first went to the Supreme Court over a century ago, it was on the basis that there's an emergency wartime problem in some of the big cities like Washington, D.C. and New York, because a lot of people have moved into the cities to run the First World War. And we've had emergencies ever since, from 1918 to 2019. It doesn't make much sense to me, but that was the justification, a wartime emergency. Well, friends, the war is over. We've had other wars in the interim that have come and gone. We don't need rent control. But you're right, it is government taking money from Peter to pay Paul. Now, Paul never objects to that. Paul likes that. But all the Peters out there who are the ones with property trying to rent it out or building places, they're not going to like it. And eventually, Paul's going to figure out that this is hurting everybody else around Paul. Because if you have fewer and fewer units, those that are not rent controlled, the rents go up and up and up. Things become more and more unaffordable. You can't take away incentives for building. When rent control was looked at in the last election, people stopped building some projects here in California. Said, we're moving to Nevada. We don't want to have on our hands an albatross of a rental property. It's not going to help.
Yeah, it seems like this also provides opportunity for the government to provide housing because of the crisis which government created.
Yeah. And government has proven to be time and time again the most inefficient provider of housing out there. It costs too much, and the government can build slums probably better than anybody else. Places that get so bad off and deteriorated, they have to be torn down. There's a famous Pruitt-Igoe housing development that the federal government in Detroit built, and they eventually had to blow the thing up, or not, maybe it wasn't Detroit, but another city in the area. And government doesn't do a good job providing housing. If you build a house with government money and it has to be union labor, you're spending much, much more. You can build a house for a reasonable price out of the suburbs versus something in the 3 or 4 or 5-story building in cities somewhere that it costs close to $500,000 per unit to build the thing. If it's sort of a federal program, $470,000 for an apartment.
Wow.
That's not the way to get affordable housing.
No, that seems to be true. I guess the answer really lies in education, maybe in videotapes such as this, and most public officials I know really want to do the right thing.
Of course.
And they get sidetracked. And there's some very vocal people that want to expand governmental control because they think that is a solution and a good thing, and not realizing that they're creating a problem for the future.
Well, they're creating an empire for government bureaucrats, and all the better if they can be part of that empire. Look, some of the first efforts to have rent control here in California, places like Santa Monica, they were vehicles for political opportunists.
Yeah.
You have a community that has a lot of renters, they get very vocal, very active, and they pass a rent control ordinance, and it's a political gravy train. You have rent control boards, and you have city councilmen who eventually become state senators, named Tom Hayden. And Tom, his heart may have been in the right place, but economically, I think his programs and his ideas just were counterproductive.
Right.
And I wish he'd understood that better. Be that as it may, rent control is the sort of thing that causes, as I said, more damage than bombs in some cities. And you have something like that, takes away incentive for building. People aren't going to want to invest in rental property. A lot of the mom and pops that have an awful lot of rental property, they're going to look at that and say, no way, I'm not getting involved in this business.
Let's talk a little bit about the Pacific Legal Foundation. Sure. Obviously, you're excited about that group.
Yeah.
How would one find out more information?
Well, we have a website, and it's a pretty good one, and you can find it by looking at pacificlegal.org. Pacific Legal is one word, .org. And from there you can explore. There's a place where you can contact us and get more information. You can, if you think you have a case that we might want to take on, we can do that. We don't charge a penny for our legal services.
Right.
We are pro bono, which means we represent people for free.
Right.
That's how we're able to represent people like Ms. Nick at the U.S. Supreme Court, because Ms. Nick certainly couldn't have paid for the work at the Supreme Court. But thanks to her, and thanks for our ability to represent her for free from tax-deductible contributions, we were able to take cases like hers to the Supreme Court. We've had a dozen cases to the Supreme Court in our existence. So I think we do a really exciting job in representing people's property rights.
I remember a key word you said, tax-deductible contributions. Well, if you need a tax shelter, there it is.
I wouldn't call it a shelter. Call it a tax contribution to help other people build shelter.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been an excellent session, and we really appreciate being our guest.
My pleasure, Al.
And we look forward to seeing you again.
All right.
Actually, at the Taxpayer Barbecue in August.
In August 8th. That's
yes.
right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for watching Taxpayer Alert.